Welcome back to Fast Forward, a series of interviews that invite visionaries who truly care about employee experience and well-being to delve deeper into the future of work on the front line. From manufacturing and healthcare to retail and transportation, in each episode we'll be exploring how technology, automation and other trends are shaping the way over 2.7 billion people work on the front line. My guest today is Kim Reynolds, a strategic HR leader with almost 2 decades of experience leading people teams in frontline industries, from revenue ranges from 500 million to over 90 billion. A visionary for the future of work, Kim has some really innovative and exciting ideas for how organizations can create a more inclusive, empathetic, and collaborative work environment for their deskless employees. Thank you for joining me today, Kim, all the way from North Carolina.
Thank you, Luke, for being invited.
So yeah, I mean, needless to say, you've been on quite a journey over the almost last 20 years, and you've seen a lot of change during that time. Love to sort of hear from you on what you sort of feel are the most sort of transformational shifts that you've observed in the HR landscape during that time, in particular, obviously, in relation to frontline workers.
Yeah, no, it's actually, and certainly not to correct you, I've been in HR since 1993, so it's been 30 years, and
Wow.
I wish I were young enough to say it was 20 still, but no, it's 30 at this point. But I think a lot has changed, and so to speak on the relevancy that's happening right now, I think the biggest shift has really come after post-COVID, and I think that for HR individuals that work in or have seen any sort of history with HR, they can honestly say this is the most difficult time that we've ever been through, because we've been through a national and worldwide emergency, pandemic, and you know, all the things that have happened to sort of reevaluate how the processes and how we do things, and then a very quick shift back into, okay, everybody's back to work, which didn't affect frontline workers as much because they continued to keep our company or businesses running, because you still had to make the widgets and you still had to continue that kind of progress. But I think the frontline worker had challenges around, you know, getting sick. Like, you know, okay, am I exposing me and my family every day when I go into work? And so HR really had to focus on the health and safety more than any other time in history. So that was a big issue for us with, you know, making sure that we could have strong policies that would help protect employees and making sure that sick employees went home and got the medical care that they could get. Since that time, we've had a rebound of all the new variations of COVID. So even when you thought you were out of the woods, it just keeps coming, to the point that I really felt like, okay, we're just going to have variants that are very low involvement with our population until the summer. And so summer of 2023, we went right back into a very heavy frontline worker exposure. We had one of our plants we had to completely shut down 2 weeks ago because every single employee got COVID. And now we're talking mass situations, sanitizers, all those kind of things that typically, you know, we thought we were sort of out of the woods on, have now rebounded again. So even though, you know, the CDC has been changing and evolving constantly, I don't think we've really seen the worst or the best of it yet. So what I think has happened, to answer your question most directly, is HR has learned we have to pivot and we have to move quickly because the unexpected should be expected. So even though, you know, you might downsize your benefits department because you don't need a full-time COVID responder, guess what? We can redeploy that person to do something else when things are slower, but it seems like it's going to be very relevant, for the time being. So, and maybe some years to come even, Luke.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I knew that, I thought that would probably be the biggest transformational shift, or the catalyst for the biggest transformational shift. I guess you've seen your function transform from a more of a support service to something that really has a direct impacts on business performance. And obviously health and safety is at the forefront of that and on the front line. It also sort of links quite nicely into this topic of empathy, which I've discussed with a couple of former guests as well. I think at the moment, from what I've read, it seems like there's a real sort of disconnected empathy perception that's driving a wedge in many workplace cultures, in particularly in the context of frontline. And in fact, I was reading a report the other week, I think it was a State of Workplace Empathy report, that found that 83% of Gen Z employees would actually prefer their organization to have a strong atmosphere of empathy over one that gave, a little better compensation. So, with everything that happened with COVID and, people's well-being, both physical and mental well-being, and the sort of the rift that came between sort of information workers and frontline workers in terms of sort of everything that got invested in making sure that people like yourself and myself could, work from home safely with all the technology and everything we needed to enable us, versus frontline workers who, as you said, still have to go in business as usual, high risk of catching COVID and everything else that went with it. I think empathy has a really an ever increasing important role to play in terms of sort of making sure that we are providing an optimal employee experience and ultimately keeping our employees active, both physically and mentally. In what ways do you think that HR leaders can help their organizations to ensure that empathy isn't just a buzzword and that there's genuine practice across their organizations which demonstrate original empathy, especially from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. That's a great segue into kind of what you're talking about over kind of my history of work. So when I started out, you were dealing with, let's just take the furniture industry, for example. Very heavy in North Carolina. We built a lot of furniture back in the day. And you had people that not only stayed in the same job for 25, 30, 35, 40 years, their children stayed in those jobs. So they, brought a legacy of family ownership to the quality of workmanship, that sort of thing. So we had a lot of cohesion, and they felt like their employer had empathy, understood kind of who they were and sort of the longevity of their career at that company, and they could move up and become a supervisor and all that kind of stuff. What happened, 20 something years ago, we opened the floodgates to China and other exterior countries that were then manufacturing in a much more cost-effective way. So employers were moving overseas, sending materials, having cheaper wages. And so a lot of those manufacturing and distribution centers closed down. And so that sort of ended an era of, our families and our children to come will always work in this sort of family atmosphere, if you want to call it that way. So to your point, when Trump came in and said, no, we're actually going to improve the situation where you can come back to the U.S. and you get taxable credits and all this good stuff, manufacturing came back. And so we saw a resurgence of, to your point, where, okay, we're an employer. How do we get people back and help them understand that, yes, we are dealing with a pandemic, but we also want to have long-term employees? What happened when that transplanted was more around competition. So everybody brought stuff back. So now if I make this table at this company, I can go down the road and make a table making $2 or $3 more. And what do you know? They have benefits. They have stronger paid time off policies. They have better benefits. So it became a very competitive market. And I would say it hit the restaurant business more so probably than manufacturing, but manufacturing just a shade under the competition, to where we saw a lot of, price hikes and price increases because they had to pay for the actual Made in America label. So a lot of that happened in early COVID times where we were starting to see manufacturing come back, and we did not have skilled people anymore that knew how to make things because they all went out in the world and did other things. So I think your point is valid around the necessity for employers to understand that it's not so much about, yes, wage does drive a lot of decisions, but it's more about, hey, we're going to create a safe environment. We're going to help you, train you, and develop you so that you can be a good frontline worker and you can have a career. All of your careers can be with our company. But we also understand work-life balance is important. So we want to have flexible scheduling. We want to make sure that you do spend time with your family, or you have, a 4-10 schedule so that Fridays you can go get your car cleaned or whatever it is you do on your days off. So there's a lot more flexibility now that sort of speaks to that sort of empathy around what you need. And you want to spend time with your children. But you want to put bread on the table as well. So it's sort of that dichotomy. But I think you're right. Employers have to understand the current world we're in, understand the competition that we have, and also play into how the employee has changed. And you mentioned this on the generation, older workers that have been in, and I mean older meaning they've been in a job longer period of time. They didn't need the same things as the new workers coming in, where promotions and work-life balance and flexibility are just more pervasive than they were in those generations. So you've got to pivot quickly, for sure.
That all makes total sense. And I think one of the areas, though, when it comes to empathy is obviously very much in communication and how you communicate. I think there seems to be still a bit too much of a sort of a top-down approach, definitely from leadership. I think you look at the data, there's quite a distinct difference between how leadership believe their communication is perceived, and versus how people on the front line perceive communication from the top. Obviously, you're sort of, you're responsible for sort of human capital management in HR. How do you go about, I guess, ensuring that leadership do begin to sort of take more action with their communication style and their approach to communication, so that the empathy actually does come through, and it's not just sort of paying lip service to what is obviously perceived as a problem and something they need to do as a business?
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic question. What I will say is that you didn't know. You hoped things cascaded all the way down. What we did this year that was revolutionary for us was implement ScreenCloud, because then there were no questions as to whether or not this actually got to the frontline worker. So everything from welcoming a new employee in, that's right there. All you got to do is glance up and look at the screen. Hey, we've had some changes in senior management. All you got to do is glance up and see, we're going to have a new CEO this year, and here's a little bit about him. Hey, we're going to have a safety meeting today, and we need to be buttoned up with this, and this as far as safety initiative. It was right there. That's one of the things that you trust, but you have to verify that things are trickling down. But I don't think it ever happens in a consistent basis. This takes out all of that. ScreenCloud is everyone that is physically at the plant today is going to see the same message. So it takes out any kind of concern, and we loop it and we make sure that we get it out there on multiple days in case, multiple shifts or you're on vacation or whatever. So I think that's one of the things. But in partnership, hey, I saw in there that we had an accident yesterday. We're back to 0 days. What happened? Let's talk about that. It initiates some intrigue and curiosity around the information that comes through ScreenCloud to go to their boss and say, hey, who had an accident yesterday? What happened? Before, you may not have known that there was an accident. You may not have known something happened. So, let's talk about even just accidents that happen. We had a big leak in a a bad situation at one of our plants, not everybody knew about that. Not everybody knew, hey, you've got to avoid these areas. Their supervisor just didn't have a chance. Maybe a supervisor has 100 employees under them. I mean, they just don't have the chance to manually walk around and tell everyone. So I think it's sort of a brilliant product, honestly, and I'm not shamelessly trying to plug, but it is truly revolutionary because there's never been anything like it that can cascade out in an instant, something that needs to be, we have a hurricane coming. How in the world are you going to tell everybody unless you go through a loudspeaker? A lot of our people wear earplugs and stuff. So just to be able to look up and see something going on is brilliant, really. So that's the short, or maybe the long answer to your question.
Well, obviously appreciate the plug there, Kim. For sure, I think what we're trying to achieve with ScreenCloud is definitely to give more of a voice to people who haven't necessarily had the channels or the opportunity to both not only receive information that is obviously going to help do their job better, keep them safe, keep them engaged, keep them informed, but also feedback to the wider business upwards typically, so that there's this sort of feedback loop across all levels of the organization, which would hopefully be part of a more of an empathetic approach to cascading communication up and down. Actually, that leads me on to sort of my next sort of question, which is more sort of obviously every organization has both, well, not every organization, but every frontline organization has information workers. And, the employee experience differs greatly between information workers like yourself and I and frontline workers. And obviously the proliferation of hybrid and remote working that's ensued since the pandemic has probably made the differentiation between those two segments even more, and probably the imbalance between those two segments more, in particular when it comes to, say, communication, where, on average, again, information workers are using at any given time sort of six workplace communication apps versus, say, maybe one if they're lucky, or maximum two for frontline workers. How do you, as an HR leader, how does your approach differ between the needs of both your knowledge workers and those on the front line? How do you try to ensure that you make that employee experience as balanced as possible for all your employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this has been a timely question from the moment we had computers, really, because before that, everybody had the same form of communication. But then when you had a desk worker, and now there's different information systems that you don't necessarily have elsewhere in the company, I think it definitely started there. So you're talking, 25 years, because I really remember before there was email. I remember when, you got memos that somebody passed around, came from a typewriter somebody had, or a word processor. So I really am dating myself. But, there was a time when, that's how you got everything through a corporate memo, any kind of changes or that sort of thing. But I think that's been a problem for a very long time. What's interesting is I'll say the graphic designers in our company, they have very different systems than I have. I have HRS, for example. I administer and run HRS. So there's always that complexity between different departments and whether you're deskless or not. What I think is important, a picking system, let's say in a distribution center, I don't have usefulness for that. I don't need a picking system because I'm doing other work. So I think everybody kind of understands you have the tools that you need for your job, and they're not the same. What is important to your question is if the main mode of communication is email, for example, and you send out something and everybody should know an email, well, there are frontline workers that do not have email. And how do you reach those when you have engagement programs, or you have company-wide news and initiatives? That's where, again, you had somebody walking around with a piece of paper and a and a notepad that said sign off because you've been informed on this or that. ScreenCloud again runs to the rescue because we can, announce those kinds of things in a much more timely and succinct way because we don't have emails for everybody. Not everyone has them. So that has solved a lot of problems for us there. Also, I think, some of this, let's take engagement for an example. If most people are responding to an engagement product through Outlook or Slack or whatever it is they use, we now have cell phone, iOS or Droid products that you can click on, and you can have that same sort of app that you would have had on a desktop to sort of get some of that engagement feature. So some of those things we kind of cross swords on. We need to make sure we have everybody able to reach a product, and it's not going to be by a laptop or a desktop. It's going to have to be by the cell phone. So that's one of the ways that we've managed that process.
Yeah, I think as you say, it's always good. There's always going to be nuances between certain departments, and I guess it's coming up with a unified approach that allows for those sort of differences between the needs of the workers, but also make sure that it is balanced, right? Because again, all the research shows that the vast majority, I think I read in Forbes, only 1% of technology spending has been invested into enabling frontline workers to do more, to be able to do their job more effectively in the workplace. And actually, I think it was around 70% of deskless workers believed that more technology would help them do their jobs better. So they're essentially crying out for more technology. But obviously it's got to be the right technology, because there are obviously implications around, having devices on the factory floor, whether it be health and safety. I know from a productivity perspective, there's concerns of people obviously being distracted, etc. Not that we aren't as information workers, of course, but obviously the concerns and considerations are very different. But yeah, given how important technology, increasingly important technology is for frontline workers, how significant is the collaboration between HR and IT when it comes to, enhancing the employee experience through technology, especially when we're talking about workplace communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am very, very close with our CIO in making sure not only we have the right type of communication, we want to make sure we can afford it, and we want to make sure that it's not going to be a burden administratively. So those are kind of the key components. Like, okay, we want to do this project, but we got to hire 2 people to run it. Is that going to be a problem for us? So, those are considerations. I'll give you an example of some of a project that hits on your point. So like annual training, there has never been a good way to deploy that. Even if you have a fantastic HRIS system, again, how do you get the deskless person to log in and do the manual training that's required? So what we, in the old days, and I'm talking earlier this year, we would literally have those workers come into a break room and watch the video and sign off on a piece of paper, and then somebody administratively would go back and upload into our system that all these people watch the video. Very time consuming, very unproductive for some people to have to sit there and upload all this. So again, with ScreenCloud, we were able to run trainings and things like that on loops that we could then say, has everybody signed off on this? Has everybody seen it? And it's much more when there's breaks, when there's time to collaborate and get into a room and say, okay, that this has happened. Is the HR person available to answer any questions that people might have? So that was really game changing for us. So the IT and I got together and said, hey, how can we utilize this product to then launch something that saves time, saves people's man hours, and we're getting things done at a relaxed and not hey, come in here, do this real quick and get back to work. It's just there and available. So that has been a game changer for us, because a lot of times, like, let's take sexual harassment, training, for example. There are questions, and you need, sometimes a physical person to stand there and do the training and allow for questions, but we don't, sometimes have time when you have thousands of people that have to get the same information at the same time. So what we did was just make sure that there's an HR manager on site when we deploy these kind of things, set appointments. If you have questions, we can collaborate that way. So again, it's kind of big game changing, but I think your IT partnership is essential to how you deploy something. Is it timely? Is it cost effective? Do we have the manpower? And you have to work together to come up with those answers.
Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, it's great to hear. You don't often hear, in fact, I mean, I'm sure it does. It's more prevalent than maybe we hear, but a lot of the time we're hearing the challenge that HR have with alignment with IT. And it's, ultimately, I think normally it comes from the place of IT not really understanding the needs or the problems that the employees are facing, and the challenges that they have obviously in the context of what we're really talking about here, communication, or information sort of flows. And so they come at it through a very IT lens where they're not really being as pragmatic as they would need to be, and they probably would be if they were more involved or immersed in what's happening on the front line. So I think, HR obviously have got a really important role to make sure that, they really do understand that technology on its own is not going to be the silver bullet to these challenges and these problems. As I'm a firm believer that technology alone is not the silver bullet to most things, but I think in particular when we're talking about communication, we have to understand there's a lot more nuances around people and change management and cultures, especially in industries like manufacturing that have obviously got a heritage on how they do things, and that's a lot more difficult to sort of transform. But it's great to hear that you're working very closely with your CIO on that sort of transformation.
Yeah, now one note to that, Luke. I believe to your earlier commentary around the progress that HR has made, that's key to this as well. So back in the day, we were administrative. We would not have had that sort of decision making or that presence strategically that we have now in HR. So I think to kind of pair those two together, now you do work in tandem with IT and HR because you have to strategically. And, back in the day, they would have just said, no, we can't do that. We don't have manpower. But, we go, okay, well, that's not a possibility. Now I could push back and say, this, to your point, is going to drive change management. This is going to be revolutionary in this or that. And we have that voice that we can be compelling and sort of couch the company's vision, mission, what we're trying to do, KPIs, and say, look, we got to do this, and we're just going to have to come together. The answer is not no, it's how do we get there? So that's a very different perspective than in years past.
And just sort of as we sort of come to wrap up, I know that you do a lot of work with sort of educational institutions in and around sort of North Carolina, sort of engaging the next generation. How do you think that educational institutions and sort of leadership prepare the next generation of HR professionals to be able to better cater for the needs of the ever-changing needs of the frontline workforce?
That is a very good question. I think that not much has changed in the way that young adults go into college and really don't know what they want to do, or they might have an idea, and as soon as they get there, they go, yeah, that really isn't what I want to do. I wanted to be a doctor my whole life, and now I see what's required to be a doctor, and I'm not interested. So I think everybody goes in going, what can I get out in 4 years or 2 years, however long they go, and have a job? And I think that hasn't changed in all the years we've had colleges. Like, what do I need to do to get the certification or the degree that then I can roll out and make $100,000 a year, whatever they're thinking. And so that really hasn't changed. What has changed is, your parent might say, oh, get a business degree. You can't go wrong. Or get a sales degree, whatever. Well, that has changed drastically because what got missed in the transition over the past few years is that we don't have professions that really help people with what's available out there. So if you look at the jobs that are open right now and those types of skilled workers that can go into those roles, we're at a loss, a big one. And it's because everybody wants to get out, have remote work, sit at home and be a graphic designer, whatever it is. Well, those kinds of jobs are not aplenty. And the ones where we need somebody picking product at an Amazon, warehouse, or we need somebody serving, dinner plates or whatever. Like, you don't need degrees for some of those things. You could simply go to a vocational school and become a plumber or become an electrician. Those are the jobs that we really need right now. So I think that there has been a big shift, even in high school, like going back to high school, where we're starting to educate our, young adults that, hey, you don't have to have a 4-year degree to go out and have a very good paying job. In the U.S., probably the number one job out there right now is a driver, a truck driver, a delivery driver. That is number one. Do you need a college degree for that? No. So I think, it's really pivotal to help, you don't have to be in debt and have a 4-year degree to be able to go out and make a very good living for your family and provide a very good service to the consumer out there. So I think, to your question, it's really changed a lot where you don't have to have a degree to be very successful and make money. A good friend of mine and I were arguing the other day about, where did all the restaurant workers go? Where did all the manufacturing workers go? And we're like, they're Uber drivers now. They're DoorDash drivers. They're Amazon pickers that deliver to your doorstep or a Walmart. I don't know if y'all have Walmarts in the UK, but it's a place where you can go and pick food and whatever, drive it off of people's houses and get paid. So, you can make a great living. Just if you got a car and a driver's license, you can become somebody that makes a lot of money in a very flexible way to go do it at, a flexible time for yourself. So a lot of that is a big challenge for our workers. And I think we've just got to educate our young folks to say, we still need engineers, and we still need, some of these very highly skilled roles that need degrees, but you can also be something else, and nobody's going to be upset if you're not president of America. You're doing something that provides, a very lucrative asset to your family that, may not have been a traditional role that people, would have said previously is important to have. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it sort of leads me into the last question that I ask all the guests on Fast Forward, which is very future looking in terms of sort of wondering what you predict or you hope the future of work on the front line will look like in 2040. So 27 years. Yeah.
I think that there is a big shift happening right now with frontline workers, and that is making scheduling more flexible. That has got to be the future, because people are just not going to come and work, an overnight shift where they have no daycare and can't, help their family survive. So there's got to be some flexibility that's driven into scheduling and making sure that people make their own schedules and do what really works for their family and maybe daycare, that sort of thing. The second piece is we've got to get incredibly creative around how we pay people. I've seen a lot of the big box companies come up with all kinds of things, the factory levels, like, oh, we'll pay tuition reimbursement. Well, most of your people don't go to college, that, that's not really helpful for them. But if you say, if your child goes to school, we'd be willing to pay a portion of that. That has been innovative. That's something new that, okay, now you're investing in my family and my child might be able to go to college. Yeah, I'm interested. So there's a lot of things that we've got to be really creative about to move into the future and say, you can't just give people pay and a 401k, stock options. You just can't do that anymore. There's more that drives someone to want to stay employed with your company. So I think there's a lot of things that perpetuate engagement, that we've got to get creative there. How do you keep people engaged? To our earlier comment, how do you communicate so that people feel part of the company and not just coming in and making a widget? They actually love the company because they kept them informed, they kept them in the loop on what's happening. And I think the last is creating an environment where people care about each other and sort of your empathy sort of situation. Like, are we training people how to be empathetic as managers? Are we helping them understand that, you can't have this 80s style management where it's get to work or you're fired. Okay, they're fired. They'll go find another job somewhere else and nobody will care that they got fired. So I think that there's a lot to educate managers on and really build their, moving in the future, build their understanding of what makes situational leadership, for example, work, where every person that I supervise needs something different. So all of those components have to move in the future, or they won't make it. They've got to incorporate all those things into their strategy.
Great. Well, Kim, yeah, that was fascinating. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us as a guest.
Yeah, I feel very privileged to have been part of this wonderful presentation that you do. I think it's so informative to have little nuggets that you can pick up, kind of like TED Talks, that you can go out and say, okay, I learned something today. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. Thank you.